All right, it's a quarter till. I'm going to go ahead and get started, just like I would in my classroom. You know, when the class bell rings, I start. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to be sharing with you some excerpts from, well, I'll get to that in a second. I get that. Hold on a second. I think some background would be good before we dive into this. Something about what led me to research apathy, motivation, and resilience. And then I'll preview the format or the agenda for today. So actually, I'll do that right now. It's really pretty basic. I'm going to give you a considerable amount of background about this project, about apathy and motivation and resilience and how I got to that, and the setup for going on the road and interviewing hundreds of teenagers. And then I'm going to share with you what a lot of them said. Okay, and then a handful of adults too. And I think that together they're going to tell a story, or at least I'm going to try to frame it in a way that I believe tells a story. So that's the format. But just a little bit about me. If you don't know me, I've taught high school for a little more than 20 years, first journalism, then English and history and psychology and special education. And this fall, my first venture into the world of middle school, the wild, wonderful world of middle school and full-time gifted education. I've taught in schools with significant wealth. I've taught in schools with significant poverty. In 2016, I helped found a private school for teenagers who learn differently, many of them who have either high functioning autism or twice exceptionality. A lot of them, struggled with anxiety. And in the summer, every summer for the past 7 or 8 years, I've taught at a 3-week residential academy at the University of Missouri for gifted high school juniors. So throughout all of those experiences and institutions, I realized that the biggest obstacle to learning and achievement, the biggest struggle with perseverance and resilience and well-being, in my opinion, based on my experience and what I'd read, boils down to motivation, right? Whether extrinsic, intrinsic, or autonomous. I needed to better understand why some of my students, regardless of their ability or background, were motivated and some were not. And more importantly, what I could do about it. Like, it was driving me crazy. I had great relationships with my kids, but what would happen is my ability to motivate them would wane. It just wouldn't last because there was something else going on. And I wanted to figure out what that was that would create an autonomous motivation in my students, something I could do to inspire meaningful lifelong change. So about a decade ago, I began studying educational psychology to learn more about motivation, and that's when I first came up with the idea of interviewing teenagers. So I try not to use the term research, in air quotes, when I always say that, although a lot of my university professor friends tell me that this project, what I'm going to talk about with you today, they say it definitely qualifies as research, but I'm not entirely convinced. So I want to make clear that I'm not trying to pass this off as empirical research, right? Like the kind of academic study that follows the methodology, say, required by the IRB. I'm super sensitive to people who might think I'm trying to pass myself off as some kind of scholarly expert on the topic. I also hate saying I'm writing a book, although I'm writing a book, but I hate saying that because everyone seems to be in the process of writing a book, okay? So I'll be sharing with you some excerpts from that book. We'll call it a manuscript, okay? And I'll be sharing pieces of my manuscript that I believe help capture the essence of what adolescents and young adults believe is the most important in secondary education. The issue for me is that we don't ask. Like, that's really the impetus for this entire thing. Imagine if you had a business and you never sought information from your target market, like the people who bought your product. You never asked them what they wanted or what they needed. That'd be insane, right? Businesses would fail if they didn't do that. But yet that's kind of how we operate secondary schools. So this whole process was to bring the voice in as an extra multiple measure, another way, another data set to be able to better understand teenagers and how to motivate them, how to engage them, how to create resilience, okay? What I won't be sharing today is how these voices align with the most recent science on adolescent neurodevelopment and educational psychology, which I'm doing, but you'll have to wait for the book, okay, for that. We don't have enough time today. We can touch on it during Q&A if you want, but I will say that this is the most dramatic, that I would say the most serious finding from the interviews, is that what adolescents say they need aligns almost perfectly with what scientists are discovering about the teenage brain and what it craves. The onset of fMRI technology, functional MRIs, has allowed us to create scenarios where we can watch behavior and then watch what happens in the brain. And it's giving us incredible insight about teenagers, about the shift in the brain development from childhood to adolescence and what it can mean for schooling. The bottom line is we don't really know exactly what it means for education. This is so new that they're still trying to figure that out. But it's important, I think, that educators are aware of what they're trying to figure out. So I've included that in this story, but not in today's presentation. I'm happy to answer questions to the extent that I can. I'm not a neuroscientist, but I'll do my best. So I want to make clear, I don't accuse secondary schools of ignoring teenagers or scientists about adolescent motivation, but I do claim that we aren't paying close enough attention. So my purpose in sharing this story is to help raise awareness and maybe inspire change, or at least a shift in mindset about how to better educate teenagers, how to increase academic engagement, how to foster perseverance and resilience. So about 2 weeks ago, as I said, there's some background, so stay with me on this, all right? It's all relevant, I promise. About 2 weeks ago, I shared a vision of I'd say a version of this presentation with a few hundred high school students who are attending the summer academy where I teach. It's a place that brings in the most fascinating, accomplished speakers throughout the country, people with incredible insights and expertise and experiences. And as I was preparing for my own session last month, the one I'm about to share with you, I went back to review some of the academy speakers from earlier that week. And here's who was speaking earlier that week. A research professor, like scientific research, right? A United Nations ambassador, a pediatric oncologist, an astrophysicist, and a Holocaust survivor whose presentation brought me to tears. And then they got me, a high school teacher. Rocket scientist, teacher. I have no doubt that some of those kids read the description of my session, or more importantly, my background, and thought, just a high school teacher. Maybe I'll skip this one. I get it. You know, to many people, perception is reality. But whether intentional or not, let me pull up my slides here. Whether intentional or not, we often rank people's value or our perception of their value or the value of what they say based on their station in life. Doctor, scientist, artist, professor, survivor, teacher, teenager. I mean, that one's even lower than teacher, right? At least in the eyes of adults. Teenager. Ugh. The way adults talk about teenagers is typically not favorable, more like stereotypical. They're impulsive, they're rude, they're immature, they're self-centered, they're fill in the blank. Well, that's one of the things I've been doing for the past 3 years, other than teaching high school. I've been filling in the blank. When I say teenagers are ... I say teenagers are experts. And that's what this afternoon's program is about, how the lived experiences of adolescence equates to collective expertise, and how this expertise may hold the potential to transform secondary education. That's overstating it, probably. Transform is a big word. I'd settle for improvement. If educators listened to adolescents, if we asked good questions and actually paid attention to their responses, we would learn things that could enhance the high school experience just by asking questions. So in 2019, that's exactly what I did. I tracked down teenagers across the country, hundreds of them, and a handful of young adults too, and asked them questions about apathy, motivation, resilience, and the purpose of high school. And I carefully and thoughtfully listened to their responses, trying to ignore any preconceived notions that I had. Like, we all have those, right? Since then, I've been speaking and writing and thinking about that project, the voices I heard and how they relate to adolescent development, achievement, and well-being. This is what I'm sharing with you today. What complete strangers told me about their school experiences and why it matters and how it relates to resilience. So this afternoon's presentation, which I call Backtracking Apathy, a roadmap to understanding academic disengagement among teens, is a little different than the ones I've given in the past because it incorporates data gathered just 2 weeks ago during that summer academy I spoke of earlier. Those students are writing the final chapter of that manuscript. Like, literally, they're writing the last chapter. Their take on all of this, the interviews, the science, and their own experiences and opinions, is the last chapter of the book. Anyway, among the dozens of questions I posed to these kids, I asked all of them the same 3 questions I ask everyone that I interview. And I'll pose those questions to you a little later. Here's what one of them said about the purpose of high school, or at least what the purpose of high school should be. Try to get out of the way here. It's kind of hard. My screen's fallen. There we go. Sorry. My makeshift studio here. Hold on a second, sorry. Virtual, it's great. We can edit all of this out, right? All right, so the purpose of high school. This is what one of them said. The purpose of high school is to prepare students for the future in a way that they'll be able to thrive in their environment. You learn who you are. You learn what you're passionate about. At least that's the goal. What adults don't understand is that teens are overwhelmed due to school and other outside circumstances. And we don't have a built-in outlet to let our frustrations and our anger and our sadness out. It just holds up inside us because we have so much to do. School focuses on assignments and grades rather than character building and preparation for the future, when we believe school should teach us how to be better beings in society, rather than just making us memorize things that most adults forget. School also teaches children that failing is the worst thing that someone can do, instead of teaching that it is a part of life and it's normal, and you need to learn how to handle that. Failing on a test is like the worst thing you can do in school. You're not taught how to cope with that. And students have no say in the way they learn to achieve goals that are already expected of them. So we're treated like children in a way that we can't decide how we want our education to go, but we're expected to act like adults and meet these crazy standards. Now, we don't have to agree with everything this teenager had to say. We don't have to agree with any of it. And she doesn't have to be right for this to be valuable data. What makes it valuable, I believe, is when we code it and categorize it against 325 other interviews. That's when we notice trends and patterns in perception. And when we compare those trends and patterns with what research tells us about adolescent neurodevelopment, psychology, and behavior, that's when a story begins to unfold. A story that I think raises some important questions about how we currently organize and operate our high schools and our ability or inability to foster volition, resilience, and overall student well-being. But again, I'm not conducting university level research. This is not a scientific study. It's a high school teacher with a truck, a tent, and a digital recorder riding around the country asking questions. The actual value of the data or of the story that I believe it tells remains to be seen. I guess that depends on how much value people assign to a high school teacher and a bunch of teenagers. I'm biased, right? I think there's incredible value in what teenagers have to say. I also think there's incredible value in pursuing something that feels right, no matter how many people think you're wrong, whether it's an academic or an occupational pursuit, whether it's reconnecting with childhood dreams. If it feels like you, it's worth doing. This is a photo I took while passing through Wyoming. Every now and then, I'm going to pop a new one behind me there. And these are all images I captured between the interviews, driving between the different spots where I conducted interviews. And I'm sharing them partly to provide a little variety, partly because they make me happy, and partly because they're relevant to my message, which I hope will be relevant to you. And I'll explain at the end, just in case, just to make sure. If there's only one thing that comes out of this project or this talk, one thing that everyone should be able to agree on, it's this: that the needs, wants, and dreams of teenagers are not that different from the needs, wants, and dreams of adults. We tend to think of teenagers as these other creatures, like these different entity with vastly different goals and objectives. And when you separate them and talk with them in a non-threatening environment where they can relax and really have a conversation with you, they want the same things. They want the same things that we want. Our lives are a mix of confidence and doubt, success and disappointment, joy and sorrow, beginnings, ends, and change. That's just life, whether you're 16 or 66. And no advice, no research, no road trip can help teenagers know how to persevere, how to be resilient, how to know what to do with your life. You just have to live it, right? But here's the thing. The impossibility of life advice in high school doesn't change teenagers' desire, their frustration, their hunger of wanting to know how to live their life, wanting to know the answers. How do I know what I'm supposed to be doing? What college? What career? What job? Should I apply for this? Should I quit that? Should I keep trying, or should I give up? A little guidance would be nice, right? How do I find happiness? How do I find happiness in my relationships? Can I salvage a failing relationship? Can I survive a breakup? Can I survive an illness? Can I survive the death of my mother or brother or best friend or pet? How do I maximize my human potential? Is self-actualization a real thing, a tangible goal? And if so, how do I get there? Am I a success? Am I a failure? How do I deal with regret? Should I forgive him or her or them or myself? Am I worthy of my family, my parents? Or am I worthy? End of sentence. Do I have worth? These are some of the life questions with which we all struggle, whether teenagers or seasoned teachers, sometimes subliminally, sometimes explicitly, always psychologically, and usually insufficiently. Teenagers know it. They watch us, adults. They watch us struggle with these questions, and they know they will too. Many of them already are. They know this is life, the tough stuff, and school doesn't teach it. In fact, school barely mentions it. Literature, you might say, and I'm a literature teacher, so I get this. Literature touches on it, the human condition, right? But ask teenagers what they think, and most will say school ignores real life, what it means to be human. At least that's what they tell me. I talked to a lot of teenagers over the past several years, interviews across 48 states in over 100 days, but not just teenagers, young adults too, dozens of 20 to 25-year-olds, and some older adults, people ranging in age from 26 to 80. 325 interviews in all, over more than 17,000 miles in this pickup truck. I drive in the mornings, interview in the afternoons, and transcribe or write at night, usually in national forests or state parks. And when those weren't available, I'd set up shop in a Walmart parking lot or a truck stop. The impetus for the project, the reason that I started thinking about it and eventually did it, was to try to uncover the root causes of adolescent apathy towards school. And I can tell the story of how that started, but I'll tell you a lot of stories today, and I think telling that one might be overkill. So just suffice it to say that I became convinced the biggest obstacle to academic achievement and learning, which is not necessarily synonymous, was a lack of autonomous motivation, an internal drive, volition, resilience, the perseverance to push on, especially when things get tough. And I wanted to find out what I could do differently to help my students who are struggling. It is amazing what we can learn from teenagers when we shut up and listen to them, when adults actually hear them, not merely, and you know this because we've all been there, not merely wait for them to stop talking so we can impart our encouragement, admonition, or advice. I'm not saying that teenagers don't still need guidance. I'm just saying that adults, especially educators, are not sufficiently valuing their perspectives. I'm saying that adolescents have something important to say and we need to listen and regard their voices as instructive and insightful and respond accordingly then in conjunction with our own knowledge and wisdom. I feel like I need to provide just a little more context before delving into the interviews. For instance, how did I find 325 people to interview? I mean, let's be real for a second. I'm a 50-year-old man scouring the country for teenagers to talk to. The potential creepy factor is pretty damn high. I can't just walk up to a random adolescent and say, hey kid, can I ask you some questions? Although that's kind of exactly what I did with Jatisse here, who worked in a tourist booth near Times Square. But at least she was used to talking with strangers, so it wasn't too weird. When Jatisse was 14, she would leave the Bronx on the 4 train, switch to the 6 train, then walk 6 blocks to 103rd Street to her school, Renaissance Charter High School for Innovation in Harlem. Now she's 19 and wants to be a pediatrician, which she admits is going to be challenging. But it's the challenges in life, she says, that feed her motivation. If I fail an exam or something, that will push me. I'll look at that grade and that will push me to study harder, to build myself. Basically, it will show me that I'm doing something wrong. So I'll look into things that can help me do better. Struggle motivates to push harder, to do better. So one way to avoid the awkwardness of talking to strangers was to interview people I already knew, former students, for instance. It wasn't my preference because I wanted to minimize bias going into this, but I did it anyway, just a little bit, about I think 6 students, including Leah. She's 25-year-old former student who spent a couple years at the University of Maine studying art before leaving to become a highly skilled welder. So art student to welder, which she struggled with because of people's perception, but she is thriving in this role and is very, very good. And Botter. Botter's an interesting story. He's 24 and a former student who contacted me literally out of the blue in that year, 2019. And this was his quote, and you can see it down there on the screen. "I desperately need advice for the situation I'm in." And Botter said that he cheated. He admitted, he said, "I cheated throughout high school, including my class." And now he doubted his ability to pass 3 tests, big tests with lots of stuff to memorize for the Merchant Marines, his dream job. And he wanted me to tutor him. And then Haley. Haley's a 22-year-old former student who barely graduated high school. And it's not because she doesn't have ability. She is incredibly smart. Her social skills are advanced. But the stories that we tell ourselves, the stories that she would tell herself, her self-narrative, they can be powerful and powerfully negative. You know, how we choose to explain our past and imagine our future. Like many people, Haley struggled with her self-narrative, but she's making progress now. There were also interviews set up by my friends and colleagues, such as Grace, who is an 18-year-old who spent her childhood and adolescence in a Boise, Idaho gifted program. Grace really wanted to be an art historian, but she's worried about making enough money, so she might study something else. And there were twin juniors from Chicago that I met separately in a coffee shop, nieces of a friend of mine. One is deeply involved in everything at school. You all know this kind of person, right? The kid who runs the whole school. The other twin is completely detached from school with few friends and pretty low self-esteem. Still, it's hard to say which one is unhappier than the other. But the vast majority of all of the interviews, more than 300 of them, were complete strangers I found on sidewalks and beaches and stores and state parks, at rest stops and restaurants. To minimize the awkwardness of me lumbering up to a teenager with personal questions, I created business cards that briefly explained the project and provided some contact information for references. And I developed a sort of pitch, you know, an opening line and a demeanor that was professional enough to quickly convince them that I was relatively harmless. It worked 319 times and failed only 6 times. Most folks apparently didn't mind talking to a stranger. And in many cases, once they started, they didn't want to stop, such as Destiny, pregnant 20-year-old waitress from Kansas City. Real quickly, Destiny's story, we're talking, and she says, "I remember all the people I talked to had an instance, like an event, a memory of something that happened." And for Destiny, she wasn't understanding the concept in school, and she kept asking the teacher for help to try to teach her, you know, how to better understand it. The teacher got frustrated and said, you should know this already." So Destiny just stopped. She shut down. She said, "Screw it, I'm done," and barely graduated high school. And it goes back to that instance of asking for help and not getting it. We'll talk about the teacher's impact on motivation a little bit later. I talked to Josh. Josh was a kid on a South Dakota Rosebud Sioux reservation. Martinez, an 18-year-old graduate at a New Mexico alternative school. I saw him skating at a skate park and talked to him. And then Shalaka. And Shalaka is now a junior at the University of Rochester's REMS program, which is a prestigious 8-year BS-MD track. It's a combined bachelor's and medical degree track. So I talked to all these people, and every summer, or every night that summer, usually in the bed of my pickup truck or in the front of a campfire, I wrote little vignettes about the day's interviews, and I posted some of them on Facebook. And some of you who are in here know kind of followed that for a while. And then I've incorporated some of these into my book. All right. So here's what I wrote about Shalaka, the quintessential gifted student. This is word for word, you know, from the book. All right. I'll try to get out of the way here. We sit across from each other at a coffee shop, and she talks candidly about living a checklist life, honors classes, piano recitals, tennis lessons, ACT perfection and acceptance to an elite college, society's path to success, and for many years, Shalaka's path as well. She was good at it, good at being the best. But in spite of her intellectual gifts and extracurricular involvement, senior year for the Colorado Springs 18-year-old was full of discouragement and disappointment. Apparently, the nation's most prestigious universities have a lot of the best from which to choose. Rejection stings at any level, whether it's the Ivy League or Little League. How to handle it may be one of the least taught yet most important things for a human to learn. Shalaka learned it accidentally by abandoning the checklist life, the notion that success has a formula, that anything less than the best is failure. The way I see it, she tells me, best is a stagnant state of existence. Best is a place, it's a point. But better is like, I know it sounds kind of corny, more of a journey than a destination. I'm trying to do that. Trying to do my better is what I like to say. We can learn a lot from Shalaka about the so-called checklist life and about doing your better. I think we can learn a lot from every adolescent if we ask and listen. So most of the scientific data, there's actually data on teenagers and apathy and motivation, but most of it, the students' perspectives anyway, are collected through questionnaires. Likert scale, right? I chose a different approach, believing that Likert scale survey questions couldn't capture the essence of the phenomena surrounding academic disengagement and autonomous motivation and resilience. So only through conversation with adolescents, I believe, could we begin to learn the relevant truths of their lived experiences. And here's how almost all of those conversations started. Excuse me, I'm a teacher traveling the country interviewing people about their high school experiences. May I ask you a few questions? Simple enough. Once they agreed, and again, almost all of them agreed, I jotted down their names and ages. I'd usually start with this: did you like high school? Or do you like high school? Depending on whether they're in high school or had they graduated. And how people answer that question immediately takes the interview down a certain path. And I just follow, asking more questions as we go. And woven into almost every single interview were 3 questions, right? What is the most important thing adults need to know about teenagers that they don't know? What is the biggest obstacle in your motivation towards schoolwork? And what is the most important thing a graduate should have learned in high school? So that first question, what adults don't know about today's adolescents, I only asked teenagers and people in their early 20s. And the majority of their responses revolved around these themes. 2 things. Yes, you were teenagers once, but it's so different today. And I think a lot of adults hear that and they're like, yeah, teenagers are teenagers. We dealt with the same stuff. But the onslaught of social media, the access to literally everything in the world at your fingertips when you're 14 makes adolescents very different than what we experienced, at least unless you're a young teacher out there. But for my generation, radically different adolescents. And then the second thing was, we're trying harder than you think. We wish adults knew that we're trying harder than you think. Sometimes a comment doesn't fall within a trend or a pattern. Like I coded and categorized these, but every now and then someone would say something that didn't necessarily fit one theme. And this is one. I think this is worth noting. This is from Claire, a 16-year-old from the Midwest. And I asked her, what's the most important thing to know about teenagers? And she says, whoever fears an idle brain clearly doesn't understand that free time is what allows us to discover our passions, in addition to giving us time to care for our mental health. I don't know an adult who could phrase that better than this 16-year-old. The second question, the biggest obstacle in motivation, I asked everyone. Lots and lots of different responses from adults. 3 predominant responses from adolescents. Relationships, typically having to do with conflict, lack of academic choice, lack of being able to, not that they didn't want to study, but what they wanted to study wasn't available. They weren't given the opportunity to dig into it. And teachers, this was the most disturbing part for me. At first I thought it was an anomaly, and then it just kept coming up over and over and over from state to state to state. And obviously not every teacher, right? But there was a kid I talked to in Kansas who told me once that most teachers are great, but it only takes one to crush you. And that's what I got, a lack of support, a lack of respect. I got that comment quite a bit. And I think if we're all honest with each other, we see it in some of our colleagues. We know exactly what these kids are talking about. The third question, the most important thing to learn in high school, I also asked everyone. And there are lots and lots of responses from both teenagers and adults. But there's still a few things that were consistently mentioned among all age groups. But before I share them, and this is where I'd like to ask for your input here, and Spencer, if you could help a little bit, I'd like to know what you think. And more importantly, I'd like you to know what you think, because in my experience, not many people, even educators and students, have thought about this question, the most important question, I call it. I think it's a critical question, almost a mission statement kind of thing. So What do you think is the most important thing a teenager should learn in high school? No more than 5 words, okay? Don't go crazy on me. No more than 5 words. And if you could just type it in the chat, and then we'll give you a few minutes to think about that. And Spencer, if you can read some of those to me when they come in.
How to treat others with respect. How to see themselves as learners and change agents. Deep knowledge of self and how to solve conflict. How to deal with conflict and failure. How to see the worth in all human beings. How to persevere. How to collaborate.
And I'll have one more here, and then I'll tell you what the kids said. If we have one more.
I'll add one. How to find comfort in your own being.
In yourself? All right, I'm going to share the top 5 responses to this question, starting with number 5. Oh, there's another one. Oh, nice, that's a good one. And again, these are the top 5 responses drawn from more than 300 interviews. All right, so I've coded and categorized them and found common themes, and these are the most common themes that came up. Starting with number 5, how to be happy. How to control your emotions, love, anger, impulsivity. Social skills, how to get along, how to communicate. Independence, how to adult without the adults. And one you can't see, my slide's a little too big. Top one is, who are you? Who you are, your talents, your purpose, your meaning, why you're here. Who are you? So those that mentioned the self, that's where these came in. So how to be happy, how to control emotions, social skills, independence, and who you are. The only academic responses among my 325 interviews were history and personal finance. No reading, writing, arithmetic, no science, no technology, absolutely nothing that's on a standardized test, right? The gold standard for so-called success of students in their schools. And don't get me wrong, it's not that teenagers don't believe high school should teach reading, writing, arithmetic, and all that stuff. In fact, all of them said school's super important, and what we learn is really, really important. The content, the core academic stuff, super important. So none of them were like, that's not important. They just said that there's other stuff that needs to be there. An interview after interview. They say school should also, and most importantly, teach students the insights and skills to navigate life. How to tackle the big questions. What is happiness and how do I find it? Why do I behave this way and how do I control it? How do I make friends and find love and keep both? How do I survive and thrive on my own? And how do I figure out who I am and what I'm supposed to do? Not so different than us, right? Not so different than you and me. So I have to clarify something when I say teenagers want answers. Okay, when I say they want to be taught how to navigate life, I don't mean they want to be told the answers or given a map, right? There's a big difference. And I think in education, we miss this nuance. Teenagers tell me they don't want our answers, okay, to happiness or self-regulation or meaning. They want the tools to find the answers themselves. They want just enough clues to draw their own maps, find their own treasure. All right. I'm going to share some excerpts of the interviews, snippets that relate to the most frequent responses to those 3 questions. And they may seem like they're all over the place, but after going through them, they're definite themes that take shape. All right. So this is the biggest obstacles to motivation. These were the 3 themes that came up most often. We'll begin with the three biggest obstacles of motivation towards schoolwork, relationships, academic choice, and teachers. And then we're going to move into the 5 most important things that teenagers should learn in high school. So relationships. All right. And I'm going to just share some of these quotes from these kids. This is Paul from Oklahoma City. And he says, I'd probably say drama is the biggest obstacle, mostly with peers. You always have a group of friends and there's always 2 people mad at each other. And then it kind of spreads out throughout the group and creates all this, whatever you call it. I don't know, stress. When stuff like that happens, it's just on your mind and you can't really focus on school very well. If I had time to go into what neuroscientists are finding out about the teenage brain, you would see this is absolutely what's going on with the majority of adolescents, and we chastise them. We make fun of them. All you care about is your friends. Yeah, that is what the brain becomes obsessed with at that particular time. It's part of a natural human development, that there's this incredible desire to be accepted. There's this paranoia about what people think of me, and it drives them. So what Paul says completely aligns with what science says about the brain. Nathaniel, this kid, so I had an interview scheduled in the Capitol in Washington, D.C. with an intern, a kid that went to Princeton. But it was storming that day. It was raining so hard, and I ducked into an overhang of a building on my way to the Capitol just to get out of the rain. And there were 2 guys there, 2 young guys, and one of them was Nathaniel, an 18-year-old. And I told him what I was doing and asked him if I could talk to him, and he said, sure. And this is what he said. I was always an A student, but I always had to show people I couldn't stay in class. I was one of them types of bad people. I wasn't bad in class, but I was bad when I come out. Know what I'm saying? I always had my teachers tell me I'm a good student. You can do the work. It's just when you get to the hallways and you get around your friends, it's like your mindset just gone. Know what I'm saying? You're not that person no more. So that's like basically what happened. Right? So those are relationships. Those are just a few excerpts from relationships. The next one, curriculum, which comes to this idea of this lack of academic choice. Not that they didn't like the curriculum, they were interested in studying, just not what was in a typical high school curriculum. Brooker from Andover, Kansas said, if I could figure out what I'm interested in, I'd be much more willing to do schoolwork. Yeah, I'd love to explore interests. That's what I wish high school would do. That's what the last 2 years of high school at least should be about, figuring out what you want to do, exploring different options. And then Hehaka, a 14-year-old from Mission, South Dakota, said, if I could change anything about high school, it'd be to actually learn what we want to learn. I want to learn how to be a therapist, a counselor. I like to talk to people a lot about their problems. This next comment about curriculum came from a former student of mine at the Summer Academy. And they should let us pick what we want to study at least some of the time. And they need to allow kids to explore their passions instead of just studying for tests all the time so they can learn how to actually do what they want to do. How are we doing so far? I hope people are finding this interesting. I think our tendency a lot of times is to a knee-jerk reaction, argue against what the kids are saying, and try to resist doing that. Try to just step back and take it in and give some value to what it is they're saying, because we talk about perception, and if this is what your audience thinks, then we need to deal with what our audience thinks, regardless of what we think about whether it's accurate or not. So the comments about teachers, this is Aldahir, who I met in Times Square. He's from Mexico, who was at a summer camp in Montreal, who was on a field trip in Times Square. All right, and this is what he said. Sometimes teachers don't explain things well enough. Adults think that we can do a lot of things that we can't. There's some things that are too difficult for us, and they're constantly telling us to do it. We need help in some cases, but they don't want to help. They want us to be alone and do it by ourselves. Sometimes we need help. Instead, they often say, just figure it out. This is Leilani, who was on her break in Burger King in Beaver, Pennsylvania. And I asked her if she would talk to me, and she said, most teachers don't actually try to teach the students. More like using videos and technology rather than trying to talk to them, to each one of them, and help them through. I want to go to med school, but the biology teachers are boring. They just put stuff up on the screen and talk. They don't teach. Riley, also from Andover, Kansas, said, some adults say, okay, they're younger, so we don't have to respect them. But I think that's what kills people's confidence. They don't get respected like they should. I think everybody at any age or race or anything should be respected the same amount as anybody else. Most of my teachers are pretty good, but it only takes one to really crush somebody. And then finally, Trey. I was in Little Rock and I veered into a neighborhood and found a couple of kids dribbling a basketball up a sidewalk, and I stopped them. And this is what Trey said to me. Some teachers care, but most of them don't. 30 that care, 70 just want a paycheck. So I'm like, y'all don't care? I don't care. So what is most important to teenagers? What is happiness and how do I find it? Why do I behave this way and how do I control it? How do I make friends and find love and keep both? How do I survive and thrive on my own? How do I figure out who I am and what I'm supposed to do? And if you've read anything about adolescent neurodevelopment and educational psychology with teenagers, this completely aligns with the science. So let's talk about happiness. These were some comments I got from kids who mentioned happiness. This is Bryce. Some of you may recognize Bryce. If you were at the 2019 NSTOY conference in Orlando, Florida, Bryce was there. And that's where I met Bryce. And we were paired together for something, and I didn't have time to interview him. He had to go, but I asked him if I could talk to him later. And he said, sure. So I flew back to DC and was working my way down the coast, and we met up again in Florida, in Newport Richey, where he lives. And this is what he said. My biggest problem is figuring out what I want to do with my life, he tells me. I just want to be happy. Humanity just wants to be happy. We need to find whatever makes us happy and run with it. There were lots and lots of comments about happiness, but I couldn't find one that better said it than what Bryce said. Emotions. This is Chelsea. So when you're on the road for 100 days, you need a haircut every now and then. And I needed a haircut when I was in Greenville, North Carolina. So I went in and my God, I sound so creepy, but I go in and I said, can I hate saying this. Can I have your youngest, salon person? Then I tried to explain real quickly why, that I was doing this project. Like, oh yeah, sure. You need Chelsea. She just graduated high school. So I'm like, oh, thank you. So this is actually me getting a haircut. This is Chelsea cutting my hair. And Chelsea said, I've just got the tape recorder going, the digital recorder going. Chelsea said this: without a doubt, the most important thing kids can learn in high school is how to control their emotions. I was a wreck in high school. Most of my friends were too. There was no roadmap, no instructions for how to handle our emotions. Trial and error is all. So real quickly about social emotional learning. There's lots of best practice, like empirically sound and proven SEL strategies for elementary schools. A couple for middle schools, not many. There are none for high school. There are 0 best practice SEL programs for high school students. Okay. It's like, oh, that doesn't matter anymore. We're going to teach them from the neck up, and none of that really matters. It matters, folks. It matters, and I heard it every time I talk to someone. Social skills. Nick, 16-year-old from El Cajon, California, outside of San Diego. And Nick says about social skills, like how to talk with people and maintain relationships, that's super important. The most important, probably. Life can throw a lot of crap at you, but when you get along with people, it kind of insulates you from everything else. In regard to independence, I talked to Kareth. Kareth is Miss Cassopolis. So I didn't know, but in Cassopolis, Michigan, there's a fair every year, carnival, and they crown a Miss Cassopolis. And Kareth told me, this is not in the quote, but she's like, all my life I dreamed of being Miss Cassopolis. So she was just in heaven that day. And this is what she had to say about independence. The most important thing to learn is how to do things for yourself. I'm going through this right now. I broke a friendship that I didn't think was really benefiting me. And it was the best decision ever because it was a toxic thing. Now I'm doing things for me. This was Eli's. Another one that when I talk about this, I feel like such a creep. I'm driving on this road in New Hampshire and I pass this kid skateboarding, and I'm in my mindset of interviewing teenagers, right? So I like slam on the brakes and do a U-turn and come back for this kid. Oh, you'd think I'd be arrested at some point. But I stopped the truck and he skated up next to me, and we had a great conversation. And this is what Eli said. The most important thing for a kid to learn is how to fend for yourself, how to live out in the real world instead of with your mom, like I'm doing right now. I love Eli. He's probably the youngest kid that I talked to on the trip. And then finally, who are you? Your personality, your purpose, your meaning in life, all that kind of stuff. Not that we should know that, but it's on their minds, right? It's on our minds. It's on their minds too. This is James. I met James in a vape store, not because I do that, but because I thought I might find someone to talk to there, and I did. And James would not let me go. James talked to me for an hour and a half. He just wanted to talk. And I was listening, and he was in heaven having someone listen to him. But his quote that I picked is very short and sweet. It kind of encapsulates everything that he said to me. The most important thing a kid can learn in high school is who you are. And Christian said something similar, but Christian's is a little bit more involved, okay? So Christian, I wanted almonds and a water. I was tired. I hadn't planned on interviewing anybody in Bear, Delaware. I just wanted to get to DC and get on a plane, and I was tired, and he was in front of me, and I thought, I'm here, I might as well ask him. So I asked him a question. And he said this: there's a lot of peer pressure in high school. There's a lot of conformity in high school. There's not much finding the self. You get taught so much. You get so much information crammed into your head, but you don't get time to figure out who you are. And I got to share the whole story of my encounter with Christian, because it completely shifted my approach to who I interviewed and what I would learn. Here's an excerpt from the book, the manuscript that I'm writing about Christian's story. I'll try to get out of the way for the most part, but I'll read it all to you. Ding. Overhead speaker voice. Customer service needed in the skincare department. Phone rings at the cashier's counter. Thank you for calling your 24-hour Walgreens, trusted since 1901. Can I help you? He checks out the person in front of me. Have a nice day, he says as she leaves, then turns to his female coworker in the photo section of the store. Yo, can you take this call on 102? She needs some Revlon product. That's the only reason I'm asking you. I smirk, and I guess he sees it. Hey man, I don't know that stuff. And Christian smirks too. He returns to his script, addressing me with welcome to Walgreens, and proceeds to ring up my bag of almonds. I seize the opportunity. I have a question for you. Yes, sir. I'm traveling the country interviewing people about their high school experiences. May I ask you a question? Sure. What's the most important thing a kid should learn in high school? Individualism, he responds without pause. Individualism. What do you mean by that? There's a lot of peer pressure in high school, a lot of conformity in high school. There's not much. Another customer walks in. Welcome to Walgreens. Not much finding the self. You get taught so much. You get so much information crammed into your head, but you don't get time to figure out who you are. How old are you? 24. Have you figured it out? Have I figured out who I am? Yeah, I'd like to think so. At what point did that happen? I got shot. I've heard a lot this summer, but never something like this, especially in a spontaneous conversation. I was 20, he continues, ending the momentary silence because I had no idea how to immediately respond to this. I was running with the wrong crowd. I was running doing the wrong stuff that wasn't me. So what changed after that? Truth be told, people started falling around me. When I looked around, people that I was with prior to me falling wasn't there. I had my family and I had a couple close friends, but outside of that, not the people I was with every day. So I had to figure out what I wanted to do, what interested me, like what I was actually passionate about. What are you passionate about? This, talking, Christian chuckles. Yeah? Literally, I go around to schools and I talk. Really? He laughs, he smiles. You got a business card, I asked? I don't. I need one, he says. I ask if I can snap a photo, give him my business card and request that he contact me. He nods, smiling still, and I wish him good luck, then walk toward the door. He calls out to me before I make it out. Hey, how do I contact you? Email or phone, I reply. You can text me too. Either one works. Thanks, man. Thank you, Christian. And that's when it really hit me. I mean, I knew it was important to interview young adults as well as teenagers, but I guess I didn't realize just how important until I met Christian. Teenagers can tell you about their school experiences, about their adolescence, which is super important. But older people can tell you about the impact those experiences had on their adult lives, an impact that doesn't really fade away. So I started paying closer attention to the potential relevance of my encounters with grownups, like Jess. She's a bartender in Valentine, Nebraska, who I struck up a conversation with. I'm still dealing with the fear of failure from second grade. It's still with me after all these years. And a middle-aged woman in a tiny North Dakota town. I didn't ask her name, so I just call her gas station cashier. This one hit me hard. So I'm getting gas. I'm not planning on interviewing. It's interesting. Some of the most powerful interviews came in times when I really wasn't planning on doing an interview. But I had Missouri plates. I was getting gas. She noticed the plate. She said, "What are you doing here?" Literally, Hebron is in the middle of nowhere. And so I told her what I was doing. And so she started talking. And she said, "I dropped out. I got pregnant when I was 16, but that's not why I quit school. Teacher said I was stupid, and I believed him." "Do you still believe that?" "Yeah, but I shouldn't. They hated me because my older siblings was troublemakers. Thought I would be too. Hated me from the start. Finally, I moved away, and now I'm here at this gas station. Do you like it? Would you? Ever thought about doing something else? No, because I'm stupid." And then this is Eldon. Eldon's 26 and a fisherman in Pass Christian, Mississippi. And Eldon said, "I started high school, think I went for 2 weeks. Then I quit. Just wasn't for me. I was never good with bookwork, just hands-on. Think I would have learned a little bit better if I was in smaller classrooms, more one-on-one teaching. My problem was I got picked on a lot because of my clothes, and I couldn't read very well. I just started to go to work and started fending for myself." And finally, Sarah, who was my waitress, who was this bubbly waitress, bouncing all around, calling everybody hun and sweetie, and just the life of the restaurant. And we got to talking. And finally, I asked her, and this is a weird thing, it may be rude, but I kind of had a way of finding the opportunity to ask a personal question when it didn't seem inappropriate. And I asked her, I said, "Are you happy?" And she said, "No, I'm not happy. It's just one of those things, getting by, you know. I want out. I want to leave the past behind. We all got that one thing that we just kind of run from." "Yes, most of us do." I pause. "So Sarah, what's the key to happiness, you think?" "I'm still trying to figure that out. I just want to start new, start fresh. High school don't prepare you for this." But not all of my interviews, and I know we're getting close to the end and I want to save a little bit of time for Q&A, but not all of my interviews with adults were sad. Some were quite positive, and a few were downright inspirational. That summer, I spent my birthday, July 19th, in New Orleans in the French Quarter, and I decided to walk the streets and try to conduct some interviews. And the first one was with a guy named Jack. And Jack's there. If you go to New Orleans on a regular basis, or even once, you might see Jack with his typewriter. He's a 30-year-old poet sitting on a milk crate trying to sell his words. I walked up to Jack. I told him about my project. I asked him to write a poem to educators and politicians and parents, a message about teenagers. This is what he wrote. Answers and lived experiences. Who could have thought high school rules, best laid by wonks who'd spent decades forgetting their locker combination, policy dictated by souls who'd become comfortable walking the wider halls of Congress? Who could have imagined a body aged could keep a brain fresh enough to offer answers to a life they've not known? Give the children their due. Answers are discovered in experience. Then I asked him the most important thing question. What's the most important thing a teenager should learn in high school? The most important thing for kids to learn in high school? Community, if they can, if they have a chance to do it. Building healthy relationships with people next to you, like this. Then I walked across the street toward a woman selling her paintings on the sidewalk, literally right across the street. Her name's Adolescent. And I asked her the same question. And she said, "Speak up, be brave. Even if they think you're wrong, you should say it, because there could be somebody right next to you thinking the same thing. It's good to tell people what you're thinking so you can recognize how connected people are." And just around the corner from Adolin, in an alley, was a guy playing the guitar. His name's Murphy. And I asked Murphy the same question. I asked Jack and Adolin, the one about the most important thing in high school. And Murphy tells me this: the most useful thing that you can learn in high school is that it's not the end all be all. Your grades, though important and maybe defining of your future in some regards, shouldn't shake you to your core, because it did for me. It was about finding yourself and living that life. And as he played, Adolin comes around the corner into the alley to listen as well. And when he finished, she said to him, "That song always makes me cry." All of these interviews, my gosh, I could go on all day. So many people, so many stories, so much insight, so much to think about. I wish I could tell you how it all ends, but as I said, book's not quite finished yet, or the manuscript. But we only have 5 minutes left. I did want to share more, but that's the time I have. So I'm going to open this up for questions. I think some people have put some things in the chat. And so, Spencer, do you have anything there for anybody?
Just a lot of really great feedback and thoughts on some of the comments that you were making. Jack is a wise old soul. A lot of agreement, a lot of head nodding to some of the points that you were making throughout your presentation.
Does anybody have a, yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Althea mentions it's devastating how one bad teacher can have such a huge impact on a student's outlook on school and life. This is why there is no room to allow for even one bad apple in the educator basket.
Yeah, that was the most disturbing part of the project, was hearing that over and over. Anybody else have any comments or questions or disagreements or challenges or anything like that? I guess what I didn't mention is that in relation to resilience, when we got on those topics, the kids would always say, if we had whatever they found valuable, if we had more opportunity to explore this, whatever it was they felt was more valuable. And a lot of it came down to knowing themselves and being able to control their emotions. They said that would build resilience more than anything else, if they had time to introspect. And there's just not a lot of time to do that in high school. It's not the way we have it. What needs to happen to address these huge gaps between needs and current reality in high school? Judy, that's a great question. And obviously it's subjective. It's my opinion. Everybody here probably has a different opinion. I will tell you this summer at the Academy, I created a new class called The Best Class Not in High School. And the idea with the class was that I gave kids all this information. What I gave you today, I gave them information on neurodevelopment. I gave them information on psychology, on positive psychology, all this stuff to discuss and debate. And then at the end of the class, they were to propose what would be the best class that's not in high school. What do teenagers need that is not in there? So they came up with some great insights. But it's complicated. And I'm not standing up here saying, oh, well, this is the answer, this is what we need to do. What I am saying is that if we listen, if we engage them and they become part of the data, not just pedagogy, not just curricula, but actual use kids as data, especially adolescents. You know, the adolescent brain can function often at a higher level than ours, like not emotionally. The prefrontal cortex, we know this, right? It's still developing, but the part that can reason deductively, man, they're on. That's why they can get 36s on ACTs. They've got it. So to ignore that deductive reasoning, to say, oh, you're teenagers, we don't care what you think, I think it's really foolish. I think we need to invite them into the conversation. What that looks like, where that goes, I don't know. I think scientists don't know because they're still learning about the brain and not sure exactly what the connections are to education. But as we go through the next half century, I think we're going to find out a heck of a lot more about the relevance to specifically what's going on in the development of a teenager that's relevant to how we should educate a teenager. I just think that educators should be more aware of what's going on. I'm just buzzing through these comments here. If you have anything, if anybody wants to say, can they talk? Can they speak up? Or are they muted?
Let me check real fast. I'm pretty sure they
We
can.
can talk. We
Yeah.
can talk.
Okay. If anybody has any comments or questions, I'm available.
Chris, I'm curious for the other folks in the chat, are they hearing similar things from their own students in their own communities?
Good question. I'm curious too.
I think during distance learning this past year, and having the kids feel like they were, I don't know, I think they almost felt like they were safer to share information. And I had my chat during my classes just closed, so it was private to me. So if a kid wanted to share something, they could. I guess I'll turn on my camera so you can actually see who you're talking to. Who you're talking to. Hi. And I had so many kids who were confiding in me about different things, about their struggles with their gender identity and the problems that were going on in their homes, and how many people were living in their home, and just the struggles that they were having. And I've been teaching for 36 years, and I have never had a group of kids that I actually never met in person.
Yeah.
Who were so open, and they just needed their voice to be heard. It is what it seemed like, and it was a safe forum for them to do that. And now my fear is that when we're in person, are they still going to do that?
Well, they're so hypersensitive to what others will think of them that they probably won't. The bold ones will, but most of them won't. But I'm so glad that you opened up that line of communication with them privately, because they are dying to have someone hear them and to talk about this. I met strangers who would cry, like they were crying to me, and they'd say thank you after. Like I said, thank you for the interview, and they're like, no, thank you, just because they want to be respected and heard, and they don't feel like they are. So I don't know how we do that, how we incorporate that into a educational structure, but it's super important, especially for adolescents.
I teach middle school. I do teach middle school. So welcome to the dark.
Thank you. I'm really excited.
But I think I'm going to try to find some way to incorporate, because we're still going to be one-to-one. This is the pandemic gave us that opportunity to be one-to-one. And I think I'm going to open up some kind of a chat, just constantly in my classroom. Here's the chat.
Awesome. Love it.
Tell me what you need. Tell me what I can help you.
I have two teenagers of my own. One is entering 11th grade, one is entering 9th grade, and they were actually in the room as you were presenting. And some of the questions I would ask them before you actually disclosed the responses that you received. And they almost couldn't really verbalize, I guess, their answers right off the bat. But as you read the responses, I mean, they were chiming in like a choir. They were like, absolutely. And, in their teenage lingo, period. And that's on point. I'm like, okay, I get it. But I too am middle school, so welcome. And I know that a lot of this can help us even at the middle school level to start building and implementing a lot of these things that the older kids were saying they needed or wanted when they were in high school.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I think as I've gone through this process the last 4 or 5 years, I've always been a high school teacher until this upcoming year, and I've always thought this was the place to to address this. And I no longer believe that. I believe middle school, you know, what we know is that the brain starts to make that radical shift at puberty. That's what shifts the development of the brain, is the onset of puberty. So middle school really is where these conversations and whatever it is that we need to do, this to collect voice, needs to happen. Not that it shouldn't continue to happen in high school, it should. But I've gone down to, you know, 6th, 7th, 8th grade in my belief that this is where we need to build something. Plus, especially with the gifted kids I talk to, they're like, this is super duper important, Holmes, but we're not going to take a class on this because we're taking 5 AP classes and doing all these activities and trying to get high scores on the ACT and SAT and this kind of stuff. And that was their reality. So this is another struggle. Like my job next year as a gifted education specialist at the middle school is temporary. It's 2 or 3 years while we're writing a curriculum for the high school. So we're planning on developing a gifted curriculum at the high school that is not just AP classes, not just more rigor, but addresses some of the things we're talking about here. But the kids who are gifted high school students are saying, how are you going to do that when I'm already stretched so thin? Well, in middle school, they're not as much, right? There's not that pressure with the AP classes, not as much, or the activities. So this may provide an opportunity for us to really make some headway in regard to this. Okay, yeah, I think people probably need to bounce to other things. Thanks, Dan. Thank you, everyone. If you have any questions or comments, or you want to communicate with me, I think my contact information is with NSTOY. I can make it available to them if you want to reach out to me. It's not hard to find me. You can find me on Facebook. All right. Thank you. Thank you so much.